Welcome back to Boss Economics World, folks, your one-stop shop for decoding the economic dumpster fire that is modern governance. I'm your host, the guy who's been screaming into the void about government mismanagement since before it was cool. Today, we're diving headfirst into the latest clown show courtesy of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, President Trump's tariff tantrums, and a bond market that's basically screaming, "Get me out of here." Buckle up, because this is gonna be a wild ride through the land of economic mismanagement, regulatory sleight of hand, and a government that's apparently allergic to learning from its own mistakes. Let's get into it. Picture this, it's Wednesday, April 10th, 2025, and the US bond market is in full-blown sell-off mode. Yields on long-term treasuries are spiking, investors are panicking, and the financial world is on edge. And what does Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent do? Does he hunker down with his team to stabilize markets? Does he issue a calming statement to reassure investors? Nope. He goes on Fox Business with Maria Bartiromo and starts yapping about tweaking obscure banking regulations like it's no big deal. Because, nothing screams confidence like a senior politician casually discussing the supplementary leverage ratio, SLR, on daytime TV while the market is literally on fire. Here's what Bessent said, and I'm paraphrasing for dramatic effect: "Oh, don't worry, folks, we're just gonna fiddle with some banking rules, specifically the SLR, so banks can buy more treasuries without those pesky capital charges. Problem solved. We'll create a shiny new buyer for US debt, and everything will be hunky-dory." Now, if you're an ordinary viewer, maybe someone who's been following Boss Economics World because you're worried about your 401k or your small business loan, this might sound like gibberish. But if you're a finance pro, your jaw probably hit the floor. Why? Because what Bessent is essentially admitting, in broad daylight, is that the government is so desperate to prop up demand for US debt that it's willing to mess with the guardrails of the banking system. And not just any guardrails, the ones that are supposed to prevent another 2008-style financial meltdown. Let's break this down, layer by layer, from the surface-level absurdity to the deep, systemic rot it reveals. Because, folks, this isn't just about a bond market sell-off or a wonky banking rule. This is about a government that's addicted to debt, allergic to accountability, and willing to risk it all just to kick the can down the road. Again. First, let's talk about the optics. When markets are in turmoil, the last thing you want is a senior official going on TV to announce half-baked plans that sound like a desperate Hail Mary. Bessent's comments didn't calm the markets, they poured gasoline on the fire. Long-term Treasury yields surged over the week, with the 10-year note hitting 4.8% by Friday, April 11, 2025, according to Bloomberg data. That's the highest level since the 2023 rate hike panic, and it's a clear signal that investors are treating US debt like a risky asset, not the safe haven it's supposed to be. And here's the kicker, Bessent's TV appearance came just hours before President Trump announced he was postponing most of his so-called Liberation Day tariffs. For those of you who've been living under a rock, these are the massive tariffs Trump promised to slap on imports to bring jobs back to America. Never mind that tariffs are basically a tax on American consumers and businesses, more on that later. The point is, the bond market was already spooked by the prospect of tariff-driven inflation, and then Bessent comes along and says, "Hey, let's mess with banking rules to prop up our debt." Talk about a 1-2 punch of incompetence. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what Bessent was actually talking about, the supplementary leverage ratio, or SLR. For my finance pros in the audience, you know this stuff cold, but for everyone else, here's the Boss Economics World crash course. The SLR is a banking regulation that requires big banks to hold a certain amount of capital, think of it as a financial cushion, against their total assets. Unlike the risk-based capital ratio, which adjusts for how risky an asset is, the SLR treats all assets the same. That means a treasury bond, which is supposed to be the safest asset in the world, gets the same capital charge as a subprime mortgage or a credit card loan. The idea behind the SLR is to act as a backstop, an extra layer of protection to make sure banks don't get too leveraged and blow up the financial system. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's the kind of thing we needed in 2008. So, what's Bessent's big idea? He wants to tweak the SLR so that banks don't have to hold as much capital against treasuries. In theory, this would encourage banks to buy more US debt, creating a larger, more durable buyer to soak up the $29 trillion treasury market. Sounds great, right? Wrong. Because here's the dirty little secret, this isn't about making the financial system safer or more efficient. It's about the government desperately trying to find someone, anyone, to buy its ever-growing pile of debt. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Why is the government so desperate to prop up demand for treasuries in the first place? Because the US is drowning in debt, folks. As of April 2025, the national debt stands at a staggering $36 trillion, according to the US Treasury Department. That's up from $31 trillion just 2 years ago, thanks to a combination of tax cuts, massive spending programs, and a refusal to address the structural deficit. And who's been buying all that debt? Historically, it's been foreign investors, think China, Japan, and oil-rich countries, along with the Federal Reserve and U.S. banks. But here's the problem, foreign buyers are starting to bulk. In 2024, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries dropped by $300 billion, according to the Treasury International Capital, TIC, data, as countries like China diversified away from dollar-denominated assets amid geopolitical tensions and Trump's tariff threats. Meanwhile, the Fed has been trying to unwind its own balance sheet, selling off treasuries to combat inflation, which hit 4.1% in March 2025, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That leaves U.S. banks as one of the last big buyers standing, but they're not exactly eager to load up on treasuries, especially when yields are spiking and the market is volatile. And this brings us to the heart of the issue, the U.S. government is running out of buyers for its debt, and instead of addressing the root cause, out-of-control spending and a trade policy that's alienating our biggest creditors, it's resorting to regulatory gimmicks like tweaking the SLR. It's like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound and calling it surgery. Now, let's talk about the risks of Bessent's brilliant plan. Because, folks, we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. Remember 2020? When global markets were in meltdown, the Fed temporarily relaxed the SLR to encourage banks to buy treasuries and stabilize the market. It worked, sort of, but it also set a dangerous precedent: the government can just change the rules whenever it's convenient. And remember 2023? When rising interest rates caused massive unrealized losses on bank balance sheets, leading to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Yeah, that was fun. Here's the deal, if banks load up on treasuries because of SLR tweaks, they're taking on a huge amount of interest rate risk. If yields keep rising, as they have been, with the 10-year Treasury yield jumping from 4.2% to 4.8% in just 1 week, per Bloomberg, then the value of those treasuries will plummet. For banks that classify their bonds as available for sale, those losses hit their capital directly. For banks that classify them as hold to maturity, the losses are unrealized but still dangerous, as we saw with SVB. And if the market gets spooked and starts questioning the solvency of major banks, you've got a recipe for a full-blown financial crisis. Oh, and let's not forget the moral hazard. By signaling that the government will always step in to prop up the treasury market, Bessent is encouraging banks to take on more risk, knowing they'll get bailed out if things go south. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same playbook that led to the 2008 financial crisis, and apparently, we've learned nothing. But wait, there's more. Because this isn't just about banking regulations or the bond market. It's about a government that's actively making the problem worse through its trade policies. Remember those Liberation Day tariffs I mentioned earlier? Trump's plan to slap massive tariffs on imports, up to 60% on Chinese goods, according to his campaign promises, is a disaster waiting to happen. Tariffs don't just hurt foreign exporters, they hurt American consumers and businesses by driving up prices and disrupting supply chains. Just look at the data. The 2018-2019 trade war with China cost U.S. consumers $40 billion a year in higher prices, according to a 2024 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And that was with tariffs of only 25%. Imagine what 60% will do. Worse, tariffs reduce the dollars flowing to foreign countries, which means they have fewer dollars to recycle back into U.S. treasuries. If Bessent thinks tweaking the SLR is going to make up for that shortfall, he's dreaming. The $29 trillion treasury market doesn't just need larger, more durable buyers, it needs a government that isn't actively sabotaging its own credibility on the global stage. So, what's the takeaway from all this, folks? It's simple, we're witnessing a government in denial, a government that's willing to risk the stability of the financial system just to avoid facing the hard truth. The U.S. economy is on a collision course with reality, and instead of addressing the structural problems, out-of-control debt, a broken trade policy, and a financial system that's still riddled with risks, the government is resorting to gimmicks and quick fixes. Tweaking the SLR isn't a solution, it's a symptom of a much deeper disease. And here's the scariest part, the markets are starting to notice. When long-term treasury yields spike and U.S. debt starts behaving like a risky asset, that's not just a blip, it's a warning sign. Investors are losing faith in the government's ability to manage its finances, and once that faith is gone, it's hard to get back. Just ask the UK, where a 2022 bond market meltdown forced the government to abandon its tax cut plans and sent the pound into a tailspin. Are we next? So, what can you do, my fellow economic warriors? If you're an ordinary viewer, start paying attention to what's happening in Washington. Demand accountability from your elected officials, and don't fall for the smoke and mirrors of regulatory tweaks and tariff promises. If you're a finance pro, keep your eyes on the bond market and the banking system, because the risks are real and growing. And if you're a policymaker, well, good luck, because you've got a mess on your hands, and history isn't going to judge you kindly. As for me, I'll keep doing what I do best, calling out the nonsense, shining a light on the rot, and reminding you all that the economy doesn't have to be this way. We can have a system that works for everyone, not just the politicians and the Wall Street fat cats. But it starts with waking up to the reality of what's happening, and demanding better. Until next time, this is Boss Economics World, signing off. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, the only thing more expensive than fixing the economy is pretending everything's fine. Peace out.